My golden child brother stole $55,000 from our parents and filed a police report framing me. He forgot I'm a senior forensic accountant. I want to preface this by saying that my family has never been the screaming, plate-throwing type. We are the kind of people who let things fester quietly in the dark until the rot is so deep that nobody can fix it. Passive-aggressive text messages, long, deafening silences, and saying, "I'm fine," when absolutely nothing is fine. That is our brand. I currently live in a quiet suburb just outside of Portland, Oregon, and I've been entirely financially independent since the day I turned 18. My name is Arthur, I'm 32, and I don't say this to sound like some rugged bootstrapper, but it's simply the truth of my life. There was a particularly brutal stretch during my sophomore year of college where I survived on nothing but bulk-bought ramen noodles and tap water for 4 nights a week. I occasionally accepted a modest care package from my mother, but I paid every single cent of my own tuition, worked grueling part-time shifts at a sterile, fluorescent-lit tax preparation office near campus, and proudly walked across the graduation stage without ever asking my parents for a single dime beyond the occasional box of granola bars. My brother Julian is 28, 4 years younger than me, and he is the exact opposite. Julian is the kind of guy who walks into a room and immediately becomes the most interesting, magnetic person in it. He always has been. He's incredibly good-looking, effortlessly funny, quick on his feet, and sells high-end orthopedic surgical equipment for a living. He makes very solid money doing it. If you met him at a neighborhood barbecue, you'd probably think he was the greatest guy in the world. Most people do. Growing up, Julian was the undeniable favorite. I don't say that with any lingering bitterness. Okay, maybe just a little bit of bitterness, but it's just an objective fact. My mom, Martha, is a retired elementary school music teacher. She is as sweet as anything, but she has this massive, impenetrable blind spot the size of a parking garage when it comes to Julian. He was the baby of the family. He was the one who always needed more help, more attention, more emotional support, and more financial bailouts. I was the quiet, observant older brother who handled things on my own, so everyone just assumed I was always fine. My dad, Thomas, is 67 and a retired municipal city worker. He's a genuinely good man with a bad lower back and early onset diabetes. I know he loves us both. I truly believe that. But he spent his entire 40-year marriage completely deferring to my mom on all family matters. If my mom says the sky is neon green, my dad is already reaching for a paint swatch to match it. For years, I have kept a comfortable, healthy distance from the family dynamic. I visit for major holidays, I call my mom every couple of weeks on Sunday afternoons, and I send thoughtful birthday cards. I wouldn't say I'm estranged, I'm just separate. I built my own life and I genuinely like it. I have a nice townhouse with a small yard that I maintain myself, a career I am deeply proud of, and a tight-knit circle of close friends. It's not a glamorous life, but it's mine. Julian, on the other hand, has been circling the financial drain for years, and nobody in the family ever talks about it. He married his wife Chloe about 4 years ago. She's 27, works part-time as a social media manager for a local boutique fitness studio, and she has absolute champagne expectations on a sparkling water budget. They completely renovated their kitchen last year. Quartz countertops, a farmhouse sink, the absolute works. Julian drives a leased midnight blue BMW M3. They took a 10-day luxury vacation to Cabo San Lucas for their anniversary. Everything looks absolutely picture-perfect from the outside. But here is the thing. I know exactly what surgical equipment sales reps make in this region. It is very good money, yes. But it is not BMW plus Cabo plus quartz countertops money. Not without significant outside help. But I minded my own business because that's what I do. That's what our family does. We do not ask uncomfortable questions. I should tell you about one more specific incident before I get into the absolute nightmare of what happened. Last Thanksgiving, I was sitting at my parents' dining room table, and Julian showed up wearing a brand new watch. I'm not a massive watch aficionado, but you don't need to be a horologist to recognize a two-tone Rolex Submariner when you see one. My mom immediately complimented it, cooing over how shiny it was. Chloe casually mentioned something about how Julian had been working so hard and deserved something nice. Not a single person at that table asked how a guy with a mortgage and a luxury car lease paid $15,000 for a timepiece. I just quietly ate my turkey, took a sip of my wine, and kept my mouth completely shut. That is the context. That is the toxic ecosystem of our family. A family where one person's blatant overspending is never questioned, and another person's quiet independence is constantly mistaken for not caring. The trouble officially started about 4 months ago, when my dad called me on a random Tuesday night at 8:14 p.m. This was highly unusual. Dad doesn't make phone calls. Dad answers phone calls when Mom hands him the receiver. That is the established system. "Hey, bud," he said, and his voice had that careful, walking on eggshells quality that immediately put my entire nervous system on high alert. "Got a quick question for you. Kind of a financial thing." "Sure, Dad. What's up?" I asked, setting down the dishes I was washing. "When you were over here for Easter dinner a few weeks ago, did you, He paused, taking a heavy breath. "Did you happen to use my computer? The desktop one in the den?" "Yeah, I checked my work email on it for about 10 minutes before dinner." "Why? What's going on?" Another painfully long pause. "Your mother noticed some money moved out of one of our joint checking accounts, and she's trying to figure out the timeline of when it happened." "How much money?" I asked, my forensic brain already starting to tick. $8,500, he said quietly. I stood completely frozen in my kitchen for a solid 5 seconds, staring blankly at the wall. "Dad, are you asking me if I took $8,500 from your bank account?" No, he said far too quickly, his voice rising in panic. "We're just trying to figure out what happened. Julian thought maybe, well, Julian thought what, Dad?" I demanded, my voice dropping an octave. "He said you'd asked him about the account earlier that day, about how the online banking portal worked and what the passwords were. He was just trying to help us trace it." I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter so hard, my knuckles turned white. I told my dad, speaking as clearly and calmly as humanly possible, that I had not asked Julian a single question about their banking. I told him I had never accessed any of their financial accounts. I did not know their passwords, and I had absolutely no earthly idea what he was talking about. He stammered out an, "Okay." He said he believed me. He said it was probably just a weird bank error, and they'd call the branch in the morning to sort it out. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark at my kitchen island for 20 minutes, running every single word of that conversation through my head. Something was deeply, fundamentally off. It wasn't just the accusation that bothered me. It was the specific framing of it. Julian thought, maybe. Julian was trying to help trace it. Julian was already aggressively inserting himself into the narrative before I even knew a narrative existed. I almost called Julian right then and there to scream at him. Almost. But my professional instincts kicked in, and something deep in my gut told me to wait. Exactly 2 weeks later, I was sitting at my desk at the accounting firm on a rainy Wednesday morning, reviewing a corporate client's quarterly tax filings, when my cell phone rang. It was an unknown number with a local Portland area code. "Is this Arthur Mercer speaking?" a deep voice asked. "Speaking," I replied. "Mr. Mercer, this is Detective Vance with the Portland Police Bureau's Financial Crimes Division. I'm calling regarding a felony theft report that has been filed, and your name has come up prominently in connection with it. I'd like to ask you a few questions. Would you be available to come down to the Central Precinct this week?" I literally felt the floor tilt underneath my ergonomic office chair. The blood rushed out of my head so fast, I saw spots. "A theft report? My name? Can you please tell me who filed this report?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I can tell you it involves a formal complaint from a family member regarding unauthorized access and wire transfers from a private financial account. I'd strongly prefer to discuss the specific details in person, Mr. Mercer." I told him I would be there on Friday morning. I hung up the phone, walked over to my office door, closed it, locked it, and sat back down, staring blindly at my dual monitors for a solid 10 minutes. My coworker Brenda knocked on the glass of my door a few minutes later. Brenda is a senior partner at the firm, late 30s, fiercely intelligent, and one of those rare people who notices absolutely everything, but comments on almost nothing unless it's strictly necessary. She saw my face, opened the door halfway, and said, "You look like someone just read you your Miranda rights in a foreign language." "Funny you should say that," I muttered, rubbing my temples. She stepped inside, closed the blinds, and sat across from me. I gave her the short, unvarnished version of what had just happened. She listened with intense focus, not interrupting once, which is one of the many things I have always deeply respected about her. "You need to go into that precinct with a concrete plan," Brenda said, her tone dead serious. "Not just an explanation, A solid, documented plan. And you probably need a criminal defense lawyer before you say a single word to this detective. I know, I sighed. I know I do. She nodded sharply, patted my desk, and left the room. I sat there for another hour, completely unable to focus on my client's filings, thinking about how my own brother had somehow managed to put me in a horrifying position where I needed to hire a criminal defense attorney. My brother, who I had personally taught how to ride a bicycle. My brother, who I had driven to his high school prom because he had recklessly wrecked his own car the week before, and our parents didn't have the spare cash to fix it in time. Then I reached into my bag, pulled out my personal laptop, and started doing exactly what I do for a living. I just didn't know yet how incredibly deep and dark the hole actually went. A lot of people in the comments are asking how my parents didn't notice this money missing sooner, and why my dad was the one calling me instead of my mom. To clarify, my parents' financial setup is very old school. My dad has a city pension, but he completely handed over the physical management of the finances to my mom decades ago. The account in question was a specific joint checking account linked directly to a high-yield retirement savings account. My mom rarely checked the actual line item statements because she is somewhat financially illiterate and just trusted that the balance was fine. Dad only noticed the $8,500 missing because he was looking for a specific tax document and accidentally saw the withdrawal slip in the mail. Also, Dad has been dealing with severe neuropathy from his diabetes, which has been incredibly distracting for both of them over the last year. They were completely vulnerable. Update 1. I went down to the Central Police Precinct on Friday morning. I purposefully wore a crisp button-down shirt, a tailored blazer, and slacks, because I am the kind of person who dresses up when a police detective wants to interrogate me about a felony I did not commit. Call it a psychological coping mechanism. But I wanted to project absolute professional competence. Detective Vance turned out to be a stocky, exhausted-looking guy in his late 40s, with a shaved head, heavily bagged eyes, and a very calm, unhurried demeanor. He shook my hand, offered me a cup of terrible break room coffee, and led me back to an interview room that was exactly as depressing and claustrophobic as you would imagine from television. Cinder block walls painted a sickly shade of institutional green, a scuffed metal table bolted directly to the linoleum floor, and a large mirror on the wall. "So here's what I've got, Arthur," Vance said, flipping open a thick manila folder. "Your parents, Thomas and Martha Mercer, reported that exactly $8,500 was transferred from their joint checking account without their authorization. The formal police report was filed in person by your brother, Julian Mercer, acting on their behalf." "On their behalf," I repeated, my jaw tightening so hard my teeth ached. "Yes, he came in personally, sat right in that exact chair you're sitting in now. He stated on the record that you had access to the household computer during a recent family visit for Easter. He claimed that you had aggressively asked him questions about the banking setup, specifically inquiring about passwords and routing numbers, and that the unauthorized wire transfers began shortly after you left the house." "Absolutely none of that is true, Detective," I said, my voice eerily calm. Vance looked at me steadily over the rim of his coffee cup. "I'm giving you the opportunity to tell me your side of the story, Mr. Mercer. That's why you're here." So, I did. I told him I had used my dad's desktop computer to check my work email for exactly 10 minutes on Easter Sunday. I told him I had never asked Julian, my parents, or anyone else on planet Earth about their banking information. I told him I had no idea what specific account was even involved, nor how the transfers were executed. And then I leaned forward, looked the detective dead in the eye, and told him exactly what I do for a living. That got a genuine reaction. Just a small flicker of his eyebrows, but in police terms, it was a fireworks display. "You're a forensic accountant?" Vance asked, looking back down at his file. "Senior level, yes," I replied. "So I can tell you right now, Detective, with absolute professional certainty, that if you pull the IP logs from those banking transactions, they will not trace back to any device I own, any Wi-Fi network I have ever used, or any cellular tower near my home or office." "That is very helpful information," Vance said, scribbling a note. "We're still in the early stages of gathering the digital evidence from the bank's fraud department. I'll be in touch." I walked out of that suffocating precinct, got into my car, and sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes. My hands weren't shaking, but my heart was hammering against my ribs, like a trapped bird. The thing that kept endlessly cycling through my mind wasn't the accusation itself. It was the horrifying reality that Julian had physically walked into a police station, sat in a chair, and deliberately lied about me to law enforcement, formally and on the record. That is not a simple family misunderstanding. That is a calculated, malicious act of destruction. I called my mom that night. "Mom, did you and Dad actually file a police report against me?" I asked, skipping the pleasantries. A long, agonizing pause. "Julian handled it, Arthur. He was just so worried. He said it was just to create a paper trail for the bank, in case they needed one to refund the money. A paper trail that explicitly says I stole from you, Mom." "Nobody is saying you stole anything, honey," she cried defensively. "Julian just panicked. You know how highly strung he gets. He was trying to protect us." "Mom, he explicitly told the detective that I asked him for your banking login passwords. That conversation never happened." "Well, maybe he just got confused," she stammered. "Maybe he misremembered what you guys talked about." "Mom, he sat in a police interrogation room and gave a formal, signed statement to a detective. People do not just misremember that." She went completely quiet. And then she said the one thing that I think she genuinely, in her heart of hearts, believed would fix this entire nightmare. "Arthur, please, please don't ruin the family over one little mistake. He panicked. That's all it was. Let's just move past it." I didn't argue with her. There was absolutely nothing left to argue about. She had already decided what the official family narrative was going to be. In her warped version of reality, Julian was the well-meaning, heroic son who just got a little carried away trying to help. And I was the cold, unfeeling older brother who was overreacting to a simple clerical error. "Okay, Mom," I said softly. "I hear you." I hung up the phone, walked into my home office, and opened my laptop. Here is where the forensic accountant detail stops being a fun piece of background trivia and becomes the actual weapon of this story. The very first thing I did the next morning was hire a phenomenal criminal defense attorney named Evelyn. Evelyn is in her mid-50s, a former state prosecutor, and she possesses absolutely zero tolerance for anyone's nonsense. In our first consultation, I laid out every single detail. "If the detective does his job correctly," Evelyn said, tapping her expensive pen on her mahogany desk, "the subpoenaed bank records will tell the whole story. But we are absolutely not going to sit around passively hoping a burnt-out city detective does his job. We are going to legally force the bank to preserve the evidence." Evelyn immediately fired off a brutal preservation letter to my parents' bank. A strict legal hold on all transaction records, IP logs, MAC addresses, and device authentication histories associated with my parents' accounts for the past 3 years. She also drafted a fierce, formal response to the police bureau, categorically denying every single claim Julian made and demanding that the investigation include deep device tracing. Then I did something I am honestly incredibly proud of. I requested a copy of the police report through the public records process. When it finally arrived in the mail, I locked myself in my office and read it 4 times. Julian's statement was terrifyingly detailed. He didn't just casually say I'd asked about the banking setup. He fabricated an entire, highly specific conversation we'd supposedly had in the kitchen on Easter Sunday, claiming I'd asked about the specific account numbers and whether the bank used two-factor authentication via text message. But here is the detail that made my blood run entirely cold. The main report listed the theft amount as $8,500. But buried deep in the supplemental notes, a section Julian likely had no idea I would ever get to see, was a brief reference from the bank's fraud. Investigator noting a total suspected historical loss of $55,000. I stared at that number until my vision blurred. $55,000. My parents are comfortable, but they are by no means wealthy. My dad's city pension and my mom's modest teacher retirement savings are their entire safety net for their old age. $55,000 is a completely catastrophic, life-altering loss for them. And Julian had only reported $8,500. Why? Because he desperately didn't want anyone looking too closely at the other $46,500. Because the $8,500 was just the most recent, sloppiest withdrawal, the one that was big enough that my dad actually noticed it on a mailed slip. The rest of the money had been quietly bleeding out of their accounts in smaller, calculated increments over a much longer period. I went to work. I booted up my personal rig, a custom-built machine I use for heavy data processing. I pulled my own digital footprint first. I exported 3 years of Google location history, Apple Wallet transit logs, Delta flight manifests, hotel check-ins, and Uber receipts. I created a massive, color-coded master pivot table of every single day I had visited my parents over the past 3 years. Dates, times, durations, and purposes of the visits. Then, I cross-referenced those dates with my corporate work travel records. I sat at my kitchen table at 2:30 in the morning, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes, looking at a spreadsheet that proved an undeniable fact. For 11 of the flagged transaction dates that the bank's preliminary report had mentioned, I was physically in an entirely different state. I had flight receipts showing I was in Chicago, Denver, and Austin when the money was being moved from a local Portland IP address. I was building an ironclad case file against my own brother. And the part that truly gutted me, the part that sat in the bottom of my stomach like a lead weight, was knowing that my parents were going to fight me on this. They were going to fight me tooth and nail because admitting that I was innocent meant finally admitting what Julian was. And they simply were not emotionally built to handle that reality. The next 6 weeks were the absolute hardest stretch of my adult life. Not because anything explosive happened, but because nothing happened at all. Evelyn explicitly ordered me to be the most boring human being on the planet. I was not allowed to confront Julian. I was not allowed to have emotional conversations with my parents. I was banned from posting anything on social media. "You are building a defense file," Evelyn told me over the phone. "The best case files are assembled by people who look completely sane, calm, and cooperative from the outside. Let your brother be the one who sweats." So, I played the part perfectly. I went to work, I came home, I mowed my lawn, I called my mom every single Sunday afternoon. I kept the conversations painfully light, talking about the weather, her garden, how Dad's blood sugar was doing. She was clearly so relieved that I wasn't making a thing of it, as she put it. During one particularly sickening phone call, she cheerfully mentioned that Julian and Chloe were officially trying to have a baby. I had to bite the inside of my cheek so hard it bled to stop myself from screaming. Julian was planning to bring a child into a financial house of cards built entirely on money stolen from the kid's own grandparents. Julian, for his part, actually had the sheer audacity to text me twice during this period. One was a link to a funny YouTube video. The other was a photo of a brisket he was smoking on his patio, with the caption, "Getting pretty good at this, bro." He was casually playing the role of the innocent brother, completely convinced that his lie had worked and that I was quietly taking the fall. I did not respond to either text. About 5 weeks into this agonizing purgatory, Evelyn called me on a Thursday evening. "The subpoenaed bank records finally came in," she said, her voice crackling with professional satisfaction. "Detective Vance is reviewing them now, but I got the full discovery file. Arthur, every single flagged transaction traces directly to a device registered to Julian Mercer. The IP addresses correspond perfectly to his home Wi-Fi network, and in several instances, to his specific iPhone's cellular MAC address. Your name, your devices, and your IP addresses do not appear a single time in the access logs." I collapsed onto my couch, pressing the heels of my hands against my eyes until I saw stars. "There's more," Evelyn continued. "The money didn't just disappear into thin air. Julian was routing the stolen funds through an intermediary PayPal account, and then using that account to directly pay off his personal American Express card and his BMW lease. "So, what happens now?" I asked, my voice shaking for the first time in months. "Now we finalize your massive spreadsheet, hand it over to the detective, and we end this." Then, the very next day, Julian called me. His voice was incredibly warm, casual, and completely unbothered. "Hey man," Julian said smoothly. "So, Mom and Dad's 40th wedding anniversary is this weekend. Chloe and I are putting together a nice dinner at that high-end Italian place in the Pearl District on Saturday night. Mom really, really wants you there." He paused, and then, with the practiced, sociopathic ease of someone who has been running from accountability his entire life, he added, "Look, I know things have been a little weird between us lately, with all this bank stuff. Let's just put it all behind us. Let's just have a fresh start, okay? For Mom and Dad." A fresh start. Like he hadn't walked into a police station and tried to send me to prison. Like, he hadn't stolen $55,000 of our parents' survival money to pay for his luxury car and his wife's vacations. Sure, Julian, I said, my voice completely dead. Saturday works for me. I'll be there. I hung up the phone and immediately called Evelyn. I need my entire forensic dossier delivered to Detective Vance before Saturday night. Update 2. On Wednesday morning, Evelyn personally marched into the precinct and handed Detective Vance a 40-page, professionally bound forensic dossier. It contained the bank records, the IP logs, the device authentication histories, my incredibly detailed travel timeline, flight receipts, and a clean, undeniable map of how the money moved from my parents' retirement account directly to Julian's Amex bill. Evelyn called me at noon. Vance is reviewing it right now. He was absolutely stunned. He told me, off the record, that this is cleaner and more thorough work than his own cybercrimes department usually produces. You did his entire job for him, Arthur. You are officially cleared. The crosshairs are entirely on Julian now. That news should have felt like a massive weight lifting off my chest. But all I could think about was the impending anniversary dinner on Saturday night. I went to the dinner. I know some of you reading this are probably screaming at your screens right now, calling me an idiot for going. But you have to understand my reasoning. I didn't go for Julian. I didn't even go for my mom. I went because my dad, who had worked back-breaking labor for 40 years and never asked to be in the middle of this toxic mess, deserved to have both of his sons sitting at the table for his milestone anniversary. Even if I knew, with absolute certainty, that it would be the very last time we would ever sit at a table together. The restaurant was incredibly lavish, crisp white tablecloths, dim romantic lighting, waiters in pristine uniforms sweeping crumbs off the table with little metal blades. Chloe had brought an expensive floral centerpiece. When I arrived, Julian stood up and shook my hand with a firm grip, making direct eye contact with a warm, million-dollar smile. If I didn't have the IP logs sitting in a safe in my home, I would have thought he was genuinely thrilled to see me. My parents arrived looking so happy. Mom hugged me incredibly tight, practically weeping with relief that I was there, that I wasn't making a scene, and that her precious family was performing normally for the public. Dad clapped me on the shoulder, smiling through the pain in his back. We ordered expensive appetizers, shrimp cocktail, calamari. We drank a beautiful 2015 Cabernet. Julian held court the entire night. He told hilarious stories about his sales conferences. He charmed the waiter. He kissed his wife's hand. He was the absolute star of the table. At one point, he raised his wine glass, the crystal catching the ambient candlelight, and looked right at me with a sickeningly genuine smile. To family, he toasted, and to fresh starts. I clinked my glass against his. I ate my medium rare steak. I watched him work the room, and I thought about the 40-page dossier sitting on Detective Vance's desk. At the end of the night, we all hugged in the parking lot. I held my dad a little longer than usual. I shook Julian's hand one last time, got in my car, and drove home in total silence. At 9 a.m. on Monday morning, Detective Vance called Julian and politely asked him to come down to the precinct to clarify a few details about his original police report. Evelyn got the full rundown of what happened next from the prosecutor's office, and it is glorious. Julian swaggered into the interrogation room, completely confident. Why wouldn't he be? As far as he knew, the police were still investigating me. Vance asked him to repeat his original statement. Julian confidently repeated the entire fabricated story about me asking for the passwords on Easter. He doubled down on the lie. Then, Vance opened my 40-page binder. He didn't yell. He didn't slam his hands on the table. He just quietly slid the IP logs across the metal table. He slid the MAC address matches. He slid my flight receipts showing I was in Chicago when the $8,500 was transferred. And finally, he slid the bank routing documents showing the stolen money paying off Julian's personal credit card. Julian's face apparently drained of all color. His lawyer, who he had brought along just in case, proving he wasn't as confident as he acted, immediately threw up his hands and demanded a halt to the interview. They stepped out into the hallway for 20 minutes. When they came back, the lawyer stated that Julian would be invoking his Fifth Amendment right and answering absolutely no further questions. By Wednesday afternoon, the district attorney's office officially opened a grand jury investigation into Julian Mercer for felony theft, wire fraud, and filing a false police report. The original complaint against me was permanently expunged and closed. I was sitting in my office when my cell phone rang. It was my mom. I answered it, and the sound that came out of the speaker was horrific. It was the kind of weeping that sounds like something inside a person's chest is physically snapping in half. "Arthur," she gasped, hyperventilating. "Julian, the police, they're saying Julian took the money. They're saying he lied." "It's true, Mom," I said, my voice gentle but completely firm. "He took it." No, it has to be a misunderstanding. The account was joint. He had emergency access for your father's health." "Mom, stop," I interrupted. "He didn't just take the $8,000. He took $55,000 over 3 years. He used your retirement money to pay for his BMW and his vacations to Cabo. And when Dad finally noticed a missing chunk, Julian went to the police and tried to have me arrested to save his own skin. I saw the records, Mom. Every single dollar." Dead silence on the line. I could hear my dad in the background asking her what was wrong. "Why didn't you tell us?" she finally whispered, her voice totally broken. "Because you wouldn't have believed me," I replied. "You told me not to ruin the family over one mistake. Remember? You chose your narrative. Now you have to live with the truth." I told her I loved her, and I hung up the phone. The fallout over the next few months was absolute carnage. Julian was formally indicted. Because his name was technically listed as an emergency authorized user on the joint account, the pure theft charges were legally muddy, but the wire fraud and the false police report were a slam dunk. He eventually took a brutal plea deal to avoid actual prison time. He pled guilty to a massive misdemeanor theft charge and a felony charge of filing a false report. He received 3 years of strict probation, 500 hours of community service, and a court-ordered restitution mandate that garnishes his wages to slowly pay my parents back. When Chloe found out the true extent of the financial rot and realized that the luxury lifestyle she had been parading on social media was funded by her stolen in-laws' pension, she completely lost it. She packed her bags, moved back in with her sister, and they are currently going through a very bitter, very expensive divorce. Julian had to sell the BMW to pay for his defense lawyer. My relationship with my parents is fundamentally, permanently altered. It is smaller now. It is incredibly fragile, but for the first time in my entire life, it is actually honest. My mom is in intense weekly therapy, trying to deconstruct decades of enabling behavior. About 4 months after the sentencing, my dad called me on a Tuesday night. "Hey, bud," he said, his voice sounding older, heavier. "Hey, Dad." "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice cracking. "A real one. I should have asked harder questions when that money went missing. I should have known my own son better than to ever believe you would steal from us. And when you told me you were innocent, I should have fought for you, instead of letting your mother smooth it over to protect Julian. I failed you as a father, Arthur. I am so deeply sorry." I stood in my kitchen, looking out at my small yard, and I felt a knot in my chest that I didn't even know I was carrying finally loosen and dissolve. "Thank you, Dad. That means everything to me." As for me, I am doing better than fine. I still wake up in my quiet townhouse. I still go to work and track down hidden money for my clients. I started dating a wonderful woman who makes me laugh until my ribs ache. I didn't blow up my family. My brother did that all by himself. I just followed the money, because that's what I do.